Thank you everyone for coming this evening. I don't think we can ignore the fact that people are coming this evening also out of a deep concern about events that are unravelling now in the Middle East with Israel and Gaza, and I'm sure that a lot of us will have questions at the end about what's happening, and that all of us are thinking about the events that are very distant but also very close to us all here. And so it's our great privilege that we have as a guest speaker here in Melbourne, Gershom Gorenberg. I've been reading Gershom's writing for a long time and been setting many of your books as texts in my university courses. Gershom, I remember from the days you were writing for the Jerusalem Report, writing a commentary not only on politics but also on Torah portions, and you had so many interesting, innovative things to say. And then reading your very important seminal work called Accidental Empire, on how the settlements developed in those first 10 years post-67, from 67 to 77. And then another very important book on Jewish religious fundamentalism called The End of Days. And I read somewhere as well that you were an associate of a centre at Boston University for millennial studies, but I've noticed that that centre has closed down, and I imagine that happened at the end of the millennium. But there is a new millennium, and I think that religious fundamentalism throughout the world obviously still applies. And Gershom is a prolific blogger in his site South Jerusalem, and there was an article about the current situation that I think went up today, and it was published in one of the newspapers. And most recently, Gershom's very controversial book called The Unmaking of Israel was published. And so it's our great privilege on behalf of the New Israel Fund to have you as a guest. I know you're here as a scholar in residence of Shalom College, which is part of University of New South Wales. So New Israel Fund has brought you out to Melbourne, and it's great for us to be able to hear you. And I think your connection with New Israel Fund is very important to us as well. We have representatives of the board. The chair of the board, Robin Margot, came down from Sydney, so welcome Robin, and Rick Benjamin is here, and Mandy Katz and others who are involved in New Israel Fund. And I think many of us feel that, who are here, and I do, I'm on the International Council, that the New Israel Fund is really at the coalface of fighting for the kinds of things that you're going to be talking to us tonight. And the topic that you're going to be talking about is this, now I've got to get it right, the Second Israeli Republic, Saving the Jewish Democratic State. So I welcome you here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming to share the evening with me. I confess that in a certain sense, even though I'm happy to see you all here, there's a side of me that would rather be home both personally and professionally in Jerusalem right now. I know that the effect of a crisis like what's going on right now in emotion is parallel to the effect in photography of a telescopic lens. It makes you focus in on one spot. It's hard to see the wide-angle perspective. Nonetheless, the reason I was asked to speak tonight is to try to give more of that wide-angle perspective. So if people want to talk about things specific to the immediate situation, I'll be happy to either answer or evade questions about that at the end. But I'm going to start with the wider picture. I have to throw in here the full disclosure sentence, you know, like the sentence that you sometimes see in a news article that says that the reporter is completely objective except for the fact that he went to high school with the minister. So I have to mention that I'm completely objective, except that one of NIF's major grantees, the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, represented me in a 5-year Supreme Court battle for access to the Israel Army archives. But besides that, I'm completely objective. You've paid for my lawyer, but it has no effect on my opinions. Okay. I want to talk tonight about the history and future of Israel as a democratic Jewish state, the crisis now facing it in that sense, and what can be done about it. A democratic Jewish state, or a Jewish democratic state, is the most common phrase in Israeli discussion, Israeli political discussion. And of course, everybody, since it's a Jewish state, everybody disagrees what it means. And particularly, are those two phrases, Jewish and democratic, are they complementary? Or are they in conflict with each other? Are they in stress with each other? So I'll just present two views on that. There is an excellent book by Chaim Gantz, a political philosopher and a professor at the Tel Aviv University Law School, who in discussing Zionism says more widely that nationalism is, or can be understood as a liberal concept. It begins with its basis is the right of individuals to live in a place where a basic part of their individual identity, their culture, is expressed in the public arena, in the public square. And where, particularly in the Jewish sense, that the public arena, not just the communal arena, the public arena is Jewish, and in that arena, among other things, we can have a debate about what it means to have a Jewish state. Now, this right for a group of people to have self-determination, to have a public space, a sovereign state even that expresses their identity, exists in tension with other rights like the rights of minorities, but that's normal. In fact, courts and legislatures in democratic countries are always adjudicating the tension between individual rights. I have a right to personal dignity, and I have a right to personal security, and every time I pass through an airport, especially an American airport, the two of them are in tension. I have a right to security, but I also have a right to freedom of expression, and as we know, those two things often come into conflict. So the right of the majority to self-determination and the rights of the minority and other rights sometimes are in tension with each other. That's the view of them being, Jewish and democratic being sort of both necessary things, but having a certain conflict or at least tension between them. But once we have this Jewish state and we're having the debate about what it means beyond just a Jewish majority, I would argue that Israel needs to be democratic precisely because it is Jewish. Because democracy, in its deep sense, is not just majority rule, but respect for the minority, for diversity, and that those are essential Jewish values. The Torah says, when a stranger lives with you in your land, do not oppress him. The stranger living with you shall be like one of you, for you are strangers in the land of Egypt. It says, when there's a stranger living with you in your land, the place that obligation to respect the stranger is greatest is when we have our own society, our own sovereign society. And in a modern, more secular sense, Jews have demanded democratic rights in societies that they live in, including this one, as a minority. And if we're not making that demand in a purely instrumental sense, if we believe in that as a principle, then we must apply that principle when we are in the majority as well. So in that sense, Jewish and democratic are not in tension. They are, the state cannot be a Jewish state unless it's a democratic state. That's the end of the philosophy section. Now we'll get to the history section. For many years, as Mark mentioned, I worked at the Jerusalem Report. I was actually the opinion editor there, and I once had a columnist who submitted a column in which there was either an untrue argument or a factual error, I don't know which. And I said, I can't publish this because it's not correct. And he said, this is an opinion article, that's my opinion. So I said, okay, I'm going to explain to you how opinion articles work. The facts are the facts, but you can have your opinion about them. So I said, for instance, you can say that it's wonderful that the State of Israel was established on May 14th, 1948. Or you can say it was disastrous that the State of Israel was established on May 14th, 1948. But in my magazine, you can't say that the State of Israel was established in 1953. And then I got off the phone and I realized that that was the worst possible example I could have given, because I can make good arguments for why the actual establishment of Israel as a state happened on other dates than that. It's absolutely true that the formal declaration of independence was on the afternoon of May 14th, 1948, and that was the realization of a basic, or the basic goal of Zionism, which is that Jews, defined as a nation, as an ethnic group, achieved political independence in part of their homeland, a country where they would be the majority and shape the culture, not as a mythic or messianic event, but as a real-world, practical political achievement. I'd also note that that victory was a victory for a revolutionary movement, and if there's anything harder for a revolutionary than defeat, it's victory. That is the great psychological crisis for a revolutionary, because when you win, you have to go from being rebels to bureaucrats. You have to go from being revolutionaries to what could be called institutionaries. And that's an incredibly hard transition. And not only that, if your particular kind of revolution is that of a national liberation movement, you go from being responsible only for your ethnic or national group to being responsible for everybody in the country. So it's a difficult transition, and Israel is actually unique among the many places that went through that transition, the baby boom of newly independent states after World War II, because it's the only one established in the period between 1945 and 1965 that has remained continuously a parliamentary democracy, with a civilian government, power changing by elections, a free press, and so forth. But in any case, I could argue that the state was really born on other dates. So for instance, I would argue that you could see the state as being created or becoming a state in late June of 1948 in what's known as the Alta Lena affair. What happened was that the Irgun underground, also known as the Etzel, the right-wing underground that had broken off from the Haganah, led by Menachem Begin, attempted to bring a ship full of arms from France to Israel. Now, just days before that, Begin had signed an agreement to dissolve the Irgun as a military organization, to integrate its fighters into the new Israel Defense Forces as battalions, and to stop separate purchases and acquisition of arms. So there was a problem there with the agreement, but there was a problem that was more basic. The Irgun's original goal was actually to get these arms to the shores of Palestine moments before the British left, and to have the ship also packed with people trained in combat, and to conquer the land, and at least according to some of the people who were involved, to take power. That is to say, they wanted to take power by force of arms. Well, the ship didn't get there on time. It was working on Middle East time. It was late. So here it is coming in late June, and Begin meets with Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion's top military aide, and he demanded that the Irgun be allowed to unload the Alta Lena itself, to send the arms to its units within the army, and to its units in Jerusalem where it was still operating independently. And Ben-Gurion and the provisional government, the cabinet, said, no, you can't do that. So the Irgun didn't accept that. They sought to unload the arms by themselves, and they ordered their units, their battalions in the army, to leave their army bases and come to the beach at a place south of Netanya called Kfar Vitkin to help out. They were operating as if those units remained in the control of a particular political faction. So Ben-Gurion and the cabinet ordered the IDF to prevent this. There were battles on the beach at Kfar Vitkin and then on the beach in Tel Aviv. If you ever stay in the Sheraton or the Hilton, you know the line of five-star hotels in Tel Aviv, look down at the beach, that's where the Battle of the Alta Lena took place, before those hotels were there. The main forces on the beach from the IDF were from an elite unit known as the Palmach. The number 2 in the Palmach, a 26-year-old colonel named Yitzhak Rabin, was in command. And eventually, at the end of the day of fighting, Ben-Gurion ordered the artillery corps to fire at the ship. A shell hit the ship, the crew abandoned ship, and it was later sunk. And that was pretty much the end of the Irgun as a separate military organization. Ben-Gurion said in the cabinet, according to the cabinet minutes, the moment the army and the state surrender to another armed force, we have nothing left. And really, what that episode established was that the state had, to use the words of Max Weber, the outstanding political philosopher and political sociologist, he defines a state as the body which can claim the monopoly on the legitimate use of force in a defined territory. That is to say, only the state gets to have an army. Okay, so what the Altalena affair did is it created the situation where the government of Israel had the monopoly on military force, that there wouldn't be military forces that answered to particular factions. And this is not an obvious development. In Greece, at that very moment, a 3-year civil war, brutal civil war, was going on between the different groups that had, within Greek society, that had liberated Greece from the Nazis. In Angola, the civil war between the liberation movements lasted for 15 years. In Lebanon, to our north, one of the major political parties, Hezbollah, also has its own army. Among the Palestinians, the split between the two movements took place even before independence has been achieved. So that achievement was not something that could be assumed. It was also essential for democratic politics, for a democracy, because in democratic politics, groups negotiate their differences rather than fighting in the streets, and they negotiate their differences based on their electoral strength rather than their military strength. The Irgun and the right could no longer negotiate with the government on the basis of how many guns they had. So that was critical for creating Israel as a democracy as well. Another date that I could give you for when Israel actually became a state was the winter and spring of 1949, when Israel signed armistice agreements with the neighboring Arab states. The armistice lines were de facto borders for international purposes, but for internal Israeli purposes, those were the de jure boundaries. Up to those lines, Israeli law applied, and everybody who lived within those lines became Israeli citizens. Remember, Weber said the state has the monopoly on the legitimate use of force within a defined territory. We're so used to looking at maps of the world with lines on them that it's easy to forget. For it to be a state in the modern sense, you have to have a defined territory. So those agreements defined the territory. As a democracy, an active democracy, Israel was actually born on January 25th, 1949, when the first elections to the Knesset were held. By the way, the first motion of no confidence in the first government was filed just a little more than 2 months after that by Menachem Begin, now head of a right-wing party in the Knesset. And the reason he asked the Knesset to vote no confidence in Ben-Gurion's government is that Ben-Gurion had decided at the end of the War of Independence not to conquer the West Bank, not to conquer the whole of what had been mandatory Palestine or Eretz Israel. And Ben-Gurion said in response from the Knesset podium, it's recorded in the Knesset minutes, let's say we can conquer all the land of Israel militarily, which I am sure we could. Then what? We will make one state, but that state will want to be democratic. There will be general elections, and we, meaning the Jews, will be in the minority. When the question arose of having the entire land without a Jewish state, or a Jewish state without the entire land, we chose a Jewish state without the entire land. This is one of the things that's difficult about being a commentator in Israel. All the really important things have already been said more concisely by somebody smarter than you. Because after that, really, what's left to argue? And finally, I could say that Israel as a democracy, as a true democracy, this is the embarrassing part, was actually born in 1953. The date that I told my commentator that he couldn't use. Actually in October of 1953, when the Israeli Supreme Court delivered its ruling in what's known as the Kol Ha'am case. Kol Ha'am was a newspaper, a Communist Party newspaper. Literally it means the voice of the people. I think a more accurate translation of the spirit would be the voice of the masses. The biggest foreign policy issue in Israel at that time was whether to support the East or the West, whether to support North or South Korea in the Korean War. Ben-Gurion had tilted toward the West. The communists obviously weren't happy with this, and they ran an editorial rather viciously attacking Ben-Gurion for trading in the blood of our youth. And using a British colonial law, Ben-Gurion's interior minister ordered the paper shut for 15 days. Essentially in punishment, the actual argument was that it had upset public order. But it was basically using the power granted under this British law to close a newspaper that was criticizing the government. So they went to the Supreme Court, and Justice Shimon Agranat, in an amazing act of judicial activism in the best sense of the word, said, you can't do that. He said, Israel's Declaration of Independence is written such that it's defining Israel as a democracy. all of our laws have to be interpreted as they would make sense in a democracy. He then went back to the philosophical roots of freedom of the press and showed that you can't have a democracy without freedom of the press. He then said, we have no precedent law on the freedom of the press because we're a new country, so he allowed himself to import the entirety of American precedent on freedom of the press issues, and he concluded that Ben Gurion could not shut a newspaper because he didn't like what it said about him. And in fact, the government followed that ruling and the newspaper was not shut. This established, first of all, I should note that Argonaut was American-born, trained at the University of Chicago. This was and will probably remain the greatest contribution of an Anglo-immigrant to Israel. And it established that democracy is not just majority rule, but protection of the rights of the minority, that the government is bound to follow its own laws. And this side of Israel has continued. As I said, governments change by the vote. There's a very high participation in the political system. There's judicial restraint of the executive. And there is an intense and involved civil society of independent organizations. And we have serious threats to that democracy as well. And those threats are created in large part by short-sighted policies, by decisions with unexpected results, or unthought of results at the time. And today they threaten the state as a state, its democracy, and the meaning of being Jewish. One threat is posed both to the state and to Judaism because of the intertanglement, the relationship of state and synagogue. Among other things, this has created an ultra-Orthodox community in Israel in which most men never hold a job in their lives. And that is the result of the one law in Israel and the Middle East, which is always followed, which is the law of unintended consequences. It's not a historical, a long historical tradition that ultra-Orthodox men don't work. This is something that happened in Israel as a result of policies that were made for completely different reasons. What happened is, in 1949, in the first Knesset, one of the first laws passed was a law providing for for state-funded education. Now, until then, among Jews in Palestine before statehood, there had been three main educational systems linked to three political movements. You could send your kid to the religious Zionist schools, to the social Zionist schools, or to the capitalist Zionist schools. Those weren't the names, but that was basically the division. You had to make that choice before you sent your kid to elementary school. Amos Oz has a wonderful description in his memoir of his father's difficulty with this decision. But there were people in the state, such as Arabs and ultra-Orthodox, who had not been part of Zionism beforehand, and they weren't in those school systems. The state created an Arab school system, and it also allowed for a fourth Jewish stream, which was the ultra-Orthodox stream. And this, for the first time, gave serious funding to the ultra-Orthodox schools. Nobody worried about this because ultra-Orthodoxy was dying. It was going to disappear within a generation. And what happened was that ultra-Orthodox leaders realized that a young woman could finish teacher seminar by the age of 19 or 20, get a teaching job, which was at that time a well-paying job, and support a husband who would stay in yeshiva. And the result of funding the ultra-Orthodox school system was to gradually create what Israeli sociologist Menachem Friedman has called the society of students, a society of scholars, a society in which the expectation is that a man spends some or all of his adult life studying. And a school system for the ultra-Orthodox, which, again to quote Friedman, has no preparation for the economy of this world, but considerable preparation for the economy of the next world. Economically, that's created a growing and unsustainable burden. Religiously, it's created a community that's separate from the other society, where there can be a competition in how stringently you keep religion, and a series of radical innovations in Jewish law. Even though ultra-Orthodox society claims to be old-time religion, in fact, it's constantly changing, not by becoming more liberal, but by becoming more stringent. And that perhaps wouldn't matter if it weren't for the other piece of the interaction of synagogue and state, which is that the state has an established rabbinate, which is responsible for functions such as marriage and divorce. And so the rest of the Jewish population is subject to that growing stringency. which also has the result of alienating many people from Judaism at all. A second set of unintended consequences, perhaps better known, are those that flowed from Israel's victory in the Six-Day War of 1967. I should stress the war was unplanned. Historian Avi Shlaim, who has no respect for the narratives of either the Israelis or the Arabs, so he's not coming to this to defend anybody, says that the 67 war was the only Arab-Israeli war that neither side wanted in advance. The conquests of the Sinai Peninsula, of the Gaza Strip, of the West Bank, and the Golan Heights were not planned. They happened in the chaos of war. And the long-term consequences came out of the result not of a policy, but of a failure to make a policy about that in the first years. Now, there were warnings of the risks of holding on to the territory from the very start up to the cabinet level. A week after the end of the war, the cabinet had a discussion on what would be the future, what Israel's policy was toward the future of the occupied territories. And the most difficult aspect of that was deciding what to do with the West Bank. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol was fond of saying after the war that with the war, Israel got a wonderful dowry. The problem is that with the dowry comes the bride. Meaning, of course, we'd love to keep the land, but what about the population that lives there? Moshe Dayan, in the cabinet meeting, for instance, proposed that Israel would permanently keep the West Bank, that the Arabs there would not get the right to vote in Israel, but they would have limited autonomy over local affairs. In response to that, Justice Minister Yaakov Shimshon Shapira said that holding the West Bank with its Arab population and not giving them the vote, attempting home rule, was impossible, quote, in a time of decolonialization, unquote. This would be a colony. He said, progressive people around the world will stand up against us if we try to do something like this. And he said, on the other hand, if we keep the land and we give them the vote, quote, we're done with the Zionist enterprise, unquote, because we'll get a binational state rather than a Jewish state. Once again, you know, it's very hard for us in the commentator business to write anything after the principle has been stated again. I note that this and other statements were made by top Israeli officials, often in top secret documents that I found doing my research. I'm not quoting from campus radicals in Paris or in Berkeley, but from Israeli government papers. However, the government came to no decision whatsoever. In fact, when Eshkol met several months later with American President Lyndon Johnson, and Johnson asked him, what kind of Israel do you want, which meant, what are you going to do with the territories? Eshkol's correct answer was, my government has decided not to decide. There were so many contrary opinions within his party and his coalition that simply no decision was made. Now, politics, as you know, does not, and policy do not suffer a vacuum. When no policy is made, those people who know what they want can act to push forward their position, and the consequences have been the steady undoing of the republic, of the state. For instance, at the end of October 1967, the Minister of Labor in Eshkol's government, a man named Yigal Allon, sent a memo, I found this in Allon's office files, to the head of the survey department, which was part of his ministry. The survey department had a virtual monopoly on map making in the state of Israel, and he said, dear Alistair, from here on in, the mandatory borders and the armistice lines, that is to say the pre-war borders of Israel, the green line, will no longer appear on Israeli maps. They will only show the ceasefire lines, that is to say after the 67 war. Now, those borders were still the borders of where Israeli law extended. From a strictly legal point, internal Israeli legal point of view, those were still the borders of the state except in East Jerusalem, which Israel had annexed. I'm saying from an internal Israeli point of view. But they no longer showed up on the map. Israelis, since then, have grown up without a picture of the territory of their own country. A study done several years ago among students at two top Israeli universities found that, for instance, at Hebrew University, the most selective university, 37% of undergraduates were capable of drawing something resembling the green line. That is to say, almost 2/3 do not have a picture of the borders of their country in their mind. The green line became something akin to sex in Victorian society. It's the most important determining factor in all aspects of Israeli life, but let's not talk about it or show it, and certainly not in front of the children. This was a symbolic act, but the actual physical act of erasing the borders, of course, came through a settlement of the occupied territories. The first settlement was established in the Golan Heights 5 weeks after the end of the war. It violated law and policy at the time. It was established by a group of secular kibbutzniks who wanted to make sure that the Golan would remain in Israeli hands. Even though there was a legal and policy problem, the army, the Jewish agency, and Alon's labor ministry helped out. Alone fraudulently transferred funds to the new settlement. State officials were going from being institutionaries to revolutionaries again. Remember, it's only 19 years later. This room is divided into those people who can put only before the term 19 years and those who think that that's silly. But people were going back, middle-aged officials were going back to their youth. You establish the borders of the state by establishing settlements. What they were actually doing was undermining the laws of the very state that they had helped establish. Now, the first settlement that the government approved was the settlement of Kfar Zion in the West Bank in September of 1967. Before Eshkol brought this to the cabinet, he asked the legal advisor of the foreign ministry, the top expert within the Israeli government structure on international law, if Israel could settle civilians in occupied territory. I found the response in Eshkol's office files. It's written by a man named Theodore Meron. I'm not going to tell you his biography now, but you can ask me later if you're interested. He wrote, "My conclusion is that civilian settlement in the administered territories contravenes explicit provisions of the Fourth Geneva Convention." That is to say, international law does not allow this. However, he also noted that it was permitted to establish temporary army bases. Eshkol announced that Kfar Zion would be a base of a branch of the army known as Nachal. After that long court suit I told you about to get access to the IDF files, I found a document written by the top military officer in charge of administering the West Bank from the day that Kfar Zion was established. It's an order going out to the general staff. It says that as a cover story for the purposes of the diplomatic battle, Kfar Zion will be identified as a Nachal base. It has no connection to the army. This ruse is not only a defiance of international law, but more importantly, what it shows is that the government, at least at that stage, was accepting that Meron was right. You don't create a cover story to get around the law unless you believe that that's the law. So the government itself was, for the purpose of establishing this settlement, was willing to break laws that apply to it, international laws. Now, the most dedicated pool, from then on, secular governments from then until now have continued to support growing settlement in the territories, but the most dedicated pool of settlers has come from the religious Zionist community, which was swept by a new theology after the '67 war that basically portrayed the creation of the state, Zionism, creation of the state, the victory in '67, as filling God's plan as God's will to bring the Messiah. So if you were settling in the whole land of Israel, you were getting with God's plan. In fact, some of them said that it's not even worth talking about giving back land for peace because God won't let it happen. And strangely enough, the state, again, unintentionally has funded the transformation of that view into the hegemonic view within religious Zionism in two ways connected to settlement. First of all, from early on, certainly from 1977 when the Likud took power, one of the economic branches that was considered in order to support settlement when at least religious settlements were created were religious educational institutions, boarding schools and yeshivot. So the government was creating a situation where more and more religious educational institutions serving also religious Jews from within the Green Line would be in settlements. The second thing was that one of the many incentives, financial incentives for moving to a settlement, is that teachers who live in settlements get certain salary benefits. And it's also cheaper to live there, and a teacher's salary is no longer a good salary. So the result of this is that many of the teachers in state religious schools, including those within the Green Line, come from the settlements, and that ideology has become, it's become invisible for the most part within the religious schools because it's simply accepted. In the Israeli population in general, according to government figures, 12% of employed people are working in education. According to the same figures, 21% of Israelis living in the West Bank are employed in education. I would guess that if you went into the smaller, more ideological religious settlements, you'd find a much higher proportion, but the government figures don't break it down that way. And finally, one last thing I'll mention here is that starting in the late 80s, a new kind of religious educational institution was created with the cooperation of the Army, known as the Pre-Army Academy. Part of the point of this, from the point of religious educators, was that many young Orthodox men ceased being religious under the very real social pressure of the Army. So the idea was young men between high school and the Army would have a gap year of intense religious study and preparation for Army service. They would also receive a message of motivation to serve in combat units and advance to the officer corps, which is what was in it for the Army because it created a new motivated group of people for those units. And of course the ideology, they started in the settlements, and the ideology, the kind of religious Judaism that the young men were and are being taught is that same ideology of the state is part of the process of bringing the Messiah, the process of redemption, and the holding of the whole land is. One consequence of this, for instance, was in the 2005 evacuation of settlements in Gaza, the Army deliberately avoided using certain combat units with a high percentage of religious soldiers for directly evacuating soldiers because there was a fear of wide-scale refusal of orders. Or to put it differently, the Alta-Lana lesson is being eroded. There is at least a reason to be deeply concerned that an outside political ideological faction is having an influence on decisions within the Army. Now, again, I'm going to say the counterweight to this, if I were going to write a novel in which there was a character who allegorically represented the state of Israel, I think I'd probably choose a very successful artist with a substance abuse problem. And you'd have a problem deciding whether this person was a great success or a failure. Because at the same time as this erosion of democracy, in all sorts of other ways, Israeli democracy has continued to thrive, the press has become more free, the court has become, the Supreme Court has taken an active role in enforcing human rights. But you have these two forces at tension with each other. The state, because of the settlement enterprise, is moving backwards from institution to revolution, from state to movement. It's a failure to understand that once you have a state, you have to act like a state. You have to maintain democracy, the rule of law, and the non-politicization of the military, among many other things. I raise these issues not to condemn, but because Israel matters to me. I chose to live there 35 years ago. I've brought my children up there. I think the countries in general are known by their contradictions, like people. And the question is not even what is Israel at this moment, but which direction are we going to go in? What side of that contradiction are we going to develop? In order to reverse these trends and establish what I would call the second Israeli Republic, a renewed Israeli democracy and Jewish state, I would see three basic realms that we have to, where we have to take action. The first is to separate state and synagogue. This is a divorce made in heaven. And I say that as an Orthodox Jew. I don't want the state involved in determining who's a rabbi and who's not. What kind of religion will be taught in religious schools. I don't think that that's the business of the government bureaucracy. The second is that we have to find a better balance between self-determination and the rights of the minority. We have to reach a much greater civic equality between Jews, Arabs, and other non-Jews within the state of Israel. And thirdly, and I think this is the basis for achieving the other two, is that we need to end the occupation. What Ben Gurion said, and particularly the settlement enterprise, what Ben Gurion said in 1949 and what Shapiro said in 1967 is still true. If there's three possible goals for Israel, having a Jewish majority in its polity, having a democracy, and having the whole land of Israel in the real world, you can only have two of those things. If you keep the whole land, you will either not have a democracy, or there will be growing pressure toward one person, one vote in the entire land from the river to the sea. And at the moment that happens, you have a binational state, not a Jewish state. I also think a totally dysfunctional state. I can describe that more later if somebody wants during question time. And I would also note, if we're talking about the idea of ending the occupation, that another lesson that we've learned, and I think this week shows it even more than ever, is that that cannot be achieved by a unilateral withdrawal. The reason that Ariel Sharon withdrew unilaterally from Gaza is that he did not want to engage in negotiations with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas on a two-state solution, which would have required Israel to also give up almost all of the West Bank and evacuate many of the settlements. He wanted to get out of Gaza. He did not want to have a peace agreement. The result was that we pulled out without any of the structure that, for instance, we have and continue to have in the peace agreement with Egypt: international guarantees, security measures, and economic steps that create an interest in continuing the peace agreement. The idea was, in Sharon's view, that the Israeli military deterrent would prevent Gaza from being used as a base against Israel. I think we can agree that this has not worked out that way. So I want to reverse a paradigm that you often hear. The paradigm is that we need to give up land for peace. Believe me, I really think that peace is a good idea. If I didn't think so before, getting 2 out of my 3 kids so far through the Army would certainly convince me of that, but I did believe so before. But I want to reverse this. We need to give up the land to have a Jewish and democratic state, and the only safe way to do that is to achieve a peace agreement based on the two-state formula. Obviously, this does not depend entirely on us, but I'm saying that Israeli policy, to the extent that Israel has an influence in the situation, needs to be oriented to that goal for the sake of Israel as a state and a democracy. With your leave, I'll add one more thing to this, which is, okay, this is a nice description for inside of Israel. What's the role of diaspora Jews in this? Even with the conditions of this week, I think that we have to get beyond the emotional state of seeing Israel as a shtetl surrounded by Cossacks. This is a profoundly ahistorical and non-Zionist view of the state of Israel. It does not acknowledge the revolution in Jewish history of having an independent state or the achievements of Israel in terms of its own security and economic development. The Cossacks are not about to wipe us out. And we need a different model of the relationship between Israel and the diaspora. My suggestion here is that what Israel needs and does give to diaspora Jews is the lab conditions of a Jewish public space, of celebrating a holiday without wondering what the majority thinks, and of having an argument without worrying what the other people think, because guess what? We're the majority. What can the diaspora give Israel in that case? The diaspora can give to Israel a reminder of what it's like to be a minority, what it's like to be part of society and outsiders, that full rights for the minority is exactly what we have looked for everywhere else. We were strangers in Egypt and in France and in Germany and so forth. And that is a contribution that the diaspora can and needs to make to Israel. So I'll finish with a apocryphal story from the Cold War. It's said that, that a Soviet delegation once visited a Western country and held a press conference, and of course the Jewish member of the delegation was in charge of giving the whole Soviet anti-Zionist, Israel's imperialist and so forth rap. And afterwards a local journalist came up and grabbed him by the sleeve and said, "Look, you're Jewish, you must have your own opinion." And the Soviet Jew paused and he said, "You know, I do, but I don't agree with it." And my experience is, I can't speak for all of you, but my experience is that there's a lot of Jews in that diaspora who have their own opinion and don't think it's kosher to agree with it. And I think that in a Jewish community, in a Jewish society, what we need is the Jewish value of debate and of people expressing their views. Thank you very much. I think that there's going to be a open mic going around. I just want to say one thing about the question period. An old friend of mine who's now a rabbi of a big shul taught me this. I wanted to find a question. A question is a short sentence seeking information. I'm not saying this because I don't think it's a good idea for people to express their opinions. I just think that you have many possibilities for doing that, whether I'm here or not, in person, online, etc. And it's not fair to other people who want to ask for information if people stand up and make statements. So I would ask you to stick to questions.
Thank you, good evening, and thank you for your words. And my question connects to your comments about the Green Line and really about two-state solution. The question is, what happened to the Saudi peace plan? Did it ever get discussed at Cabinet, and is it time for it to be reviewed?
The Saudi peace plan originally came out at an incredibly bad time for it to get noticed in Israel, which was in the middle of the worst month of suicide bombings in Israel during the Second Intifada of March of 2002. Or maybe it was the end of February, I don't know the exact date, but basically Israelis weren't reading about what was happening anywhere else. And besides that, the Sharon government certainly wasn't going to consider it. At least one time since then, the Arab League has reaffirmed this idea. I don't think that it's, I think that there's people in Israel and politicians in Israel who have argued that this is a basis for negotiation. Not that we would sign tomorrow on every line of the Saudi Peace Initiative, or the Arab League Peace Initiative, but it is a basis for negotiations. If there has ever been a cabinet discussion of this, it certainly hasn't been publicized. The most basic parts of the Saudi Peace Initiative, or the Arab League Peace Initiative of 2002, is a proposal for a full peace and full normalization between Israel and the Arab world based on the 1967 lines and an agreed solution to the refugee problem. The important word in that sentence is agreed. What that means is, in diplomatic terms, is the two sides have to agree on it, not just an imposition of one side, either side, on the other. Again, I don't think that every word of that and the rest of the initiative is something that an Israeli government should sign on tomorrow, but it's certainly a very good basis for negotiations, and unfortunately I don't think that it's been taken with sufficient seriousness in the political structure in the state.
Thank you for your presentation, it was very insightful. I just wanted to ask you a question about Hamas and the current situation. Both Gershom Baskin and Aluf Ben have written in previous days that there's a sort of pragmatic side of Hamas that has negotiated with us in the past. Just hypothetically, assuming Israel did accede to all of Hamas's demands, lifted the blockade, released the prisoners, everything they want, would that actually make Israel safer, in your opinion?
I don't know what would happen in an agreement of that sort. One of the difficult situations, both about speaking and about what editors say to me, is people always want me to tell what's going to happen next. One of the things I've learned from writing Israeli history is what happened next is not what we expect, so I'm not going to try to predict that. However, I can describe the situation as it is right now, and I think that there's two aspects of that situation, at least, that are important to note. One is Hamas is a fairly large movement with internal divisions. Somebody who passes for a moderate in Hamas is not somebody whose political opinions I like, but moderate means being more pragmatic and usually expresses itself in the idea of I could accept a two-state solution as long as we don't have to be the ones to sign it, as long as we don't have to be the ones to recognize Israel. So for instance, the basic outline, which has come up several times for Palestinian reconciliation, the idea is that Hamas would rejoin the government, that Abbas, as the president and the leader of Fatah, would be empowered to negotiate with Israel on the grounds that any agreement would be submitted to a referendum, and Hamas would accept the will of the Palestinian people. What this means is you can go ahead and negotiate as long as we don't have to actually admit that we've changed our ideology by signing on it. And there are other people in Hamas who don't accept that at all. I mean, I've interviewed Hamasniks who talk about jihad until the last Israeli is gone. I think that there's two things, and there's one other aspect of the situation, is that when we talk about Gaza, we have to remember that Gaza doesn't exist in a vacuum. When we left Gaza, we didn't solve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So from an internal Palestinian point of view, including that of people who seek a two-state solution, Palestinians have not gained independence, and the West Bank is still under direct Israeli occupation, and Gaza does not have control of its borders or its trade or anything else. So expecting that that's the end of the conflict is, from either side, is pretty naive. So I think that there is a serious chance that we could reach a ceasefire with Hamas that involved more than just we're not going to fire until the next one fires. It would have to include, and that would gain the support of enough people in Hamas that there would be a good chance, not a guarantee of it surviving. It would have to include our allowing Gaza to develop. It is to say, we have to find a way, even if we're a mechanism for preventing the import of arms, that does not mean that Israel has a stranglehold on Gaza. I refer to this as the Taiwan non-state solution, which is to say Taiwan acts as a state. Everybody knows that it's a state. They claim, as far as I know to this day, that they're the rulers of all China. They are allowed to make this claim as long as they do nothing about it, and life goes on. However, I think for any arrangement like that to be stable, there has to be, it won't work unless we address the wider Palestinian-Israeli problem. We can't expect that there's going to be a long-term ceasefire, certainly not a long-term peace with Hamas in Gaza, unless we are at the same time pursuing a diplomatic agreement which brings Palestinian independence, which is to say, that's only part of the puzzle. And in fact, that's the only thing that would create a motivation for keeping this agreement. So even if tomorrow or the next day, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama pull off this miracle and there's a ceasefire, and even if in the next stage it looks something like what I've just described, the next stage after that still has to be the renewal of the diplomatic process and aiming for not a ceasefire, but a peace agreement based on the two-state principle.
Hi, Gershom. Sorry about that. I just wanted to know a bit more about the one-state solution, if it is a solution ever, and how you think that would look.
Okay, first of all, if I've used the term two-state solution, I retract it. I should have said two-state arrangement. A mentor of mine, Israeli political scientist Yaron Ezrahi, taught me that in politics there aren't solutions, there are arrangements. Some arrangements are better than others. And I think that that's wise. That you shouldn't expect that everything is going to be solved. Your goal is to have a better arrangement than what you've got right now. I think that the one-state arrangement is a very unsuccessful arrangement starting out and what would go on. Because what you're talking about, if you talk about creating a single state, is you've eliminated the issue of borders, but all of the other issues that are on the table between Israelis and Palestinians remain, and now are the domestic agenda of a state that's got about half Jewish and half Palestinian population. You haven't solved the settlement problem because you have Israeli settlements located on land that Palestinians, much of that land is claimed by Palestinians as privately owned land, and those are right now closed communities that Palestinians can't join. Both of those things would end up before courts that would include both Jews and Palestinians, and whatever decision those courts made, or whatever decision the parliament made about the future of those settlements, would have to be carried out by a police or military which would apparently be half Jewish and half Palestinian. I don't think that this is going to work very well. The issue of the holy places is not solved. It's turned over to the new parliament. The issue of the economic disparity is not solved. It's handed over to the new parliament. I could go on and on. All of the issues that are on the table, except for borders, get translated into the internal political agenda of a paralyzed state. In the very best case, in the utopian case, it would look like Belgium, where it's usually impossible to form a government, and it's more likely to look like Bosnia in the 90s. Between that and the two-state arrangement, whatever the difficulties are reaching a two-state arrangement and whatever the practical problems are, I think the price of a one-state solution is higher.
Thank you very much for your talk. Very interesting. Sorry about my voice. Look, I just wanted to ask you about the forthcoming vote that's going to occur, I think, in the UN National Assembly, where Australia will be a participant, regarding the unilateral declaration of a Palestinian state. I take it from the logic of what you're saying about a two-state solution that you wouldn't consider that to be entirely out of the question, and that at the moment in Australia there is some division over how the Australian government should react to this. I wonder if you have an opinion on this, or whether you think we should just follow whatever America does.
Okay, first of all, the argument that it's a unilateral move is correct, but Israel has a very hard time arguing against unilateral moves because building settlements in the West Bank is the epitome of a unilateral move. So we're standing on poor ground. So unclean hands is the term in law, at least as I learned, the little bit of law that I learned. You're coming to a case not in the best of condition to argue it. In part, the Palestinian application to the UN, I could say, is a Zionist victory. Palestinians, at least when Abbas applied for full membership in the UN, it spoke of a Palestinian state alongside of Israel. So the idea of this Declaration of Independence, yes, it doesn't fit into the negotiating process that isn't going on. I don't think that it's an immense disaster, but I do think that it's an incredible diplomatic opportunity. And in this case, I have to say that the diplomatic opportunity most needs to be seized by the United States because it's the one that has the influence. Instead of just saying we're voting against it, it would be much better to say we'll stand in the background, we'll abstain, we'll even support it if X, Y, and Z happens. If, on the other, we say to the Israelis, you know, you want our support, maybe you should think about that request we made a couple years back to stop settlement construction, which turns the Americans should turn to the Palestinians and say, you want to go ahead with this? We want to change the resolution a little bit so it's more specific about what alongside Israel means, and it leaves X, Y, and Z issues to negotiations between the two sides explicitly. Because that would be a better resolution, and that would be a step forward. Where does Australia fit into this? I have to say again, I think that the power that is able to press for that right now is, first of all, the United States, and second of all, the European Union. And diplomacy from other angles should be aimed at those governments, urging them to seize this as an opportunity rather than seeing it only as a threat.
I recently read a book by Yehuda Shenhav called Beyond the Two-State Solution, with which I don't agree with his conclusions, but I just wanted to ask you, because in it he presents a critique of several people and includes your name in it, and talks about those who romanticize in a nostalgic way the Israel of those 19 years or so between its establishment, whatever date we agree on, and 1967, and who talk about the Green Line and the accidental empire, as you call it, post-67 as being the beginning of the erosion of Israeli democracy, and then romanticising about a return to that earlier phase. And yet he talks about the Green Line effectively having been inside Israel in terms of ongoing displacement of the Palestinian Israelis. So I'm just wondering how you would respond to that critique.
let me respond by mentioning a different critique. I'll see your critique and raise your critique. There is a very interesting book written by an Israeli political geographer named Oren Yiftachel called Ethnocracy. And Yiftachel argues that an ethnocracy is a state which serves the interests of one ethnic group against the interests of another ethnic group. And then he makes a totally fallacious statement. The first part is really good, that a country cannot be a democracy and an ethnocracy at the same time. In principle, that makes perfect sense. In reality, it doesn't fit history. I'll give the best example, which is the country I grew up in. The United States, at its establishment, became an example for democratic revolutions around the world, and its constitution established it as an ethnocracy, where only white people could have citizenship. And if the principle wasn't clear, and slavery was enshrined in the Constitution, if the principle wasn't clear enough, in 1857, the American Supreme Court handed down a decision called the Dred Scott decision that explicitly said that only white people could be citizens of the United States. If I looked at the United States at 1857, looking at the contradiction between democracy and ethnocracy, I would probably say it was an ethnocracy with a very thin facade of democracy. And if I looked at the United States, say, the second week of November 2008, I would say this is a democracy with a very painful tradition of ethnocracy. Early Israel was both of those things. The people who make the sort of post-colonial argument that squeezes Israel into the category of colonialism, and either you're colonial or you're not colonial, that's a great theoretical discussion, but it doesn't fit history. In history, every unhappy country is unhappy in its own way, and these categories break down. The Israel of 48 to 67 had tremendous flaws as a democracy, and there was a progress toward more democratic norms. Just as an example, and this is a really critical example, the early situation of Israeli Arabs from 1949 onward is that most of them were living under military government, but were also voting citizens of the State of Israel. Voting is really important. It's because Israeli Arabs had the vote that other parties besides the ruling Mapai party wanted to get rid of the military government from the left to the right all the way over to Begin, because they said, correctly, that Mapai was using the military government to push Arab voters to vote for Mapai, and the only way that there would be a level playing field was to get rid of the military government. So the democratic energy, shall we say, the democratic force, everybody having the vote, led to progress toward a more democratic situation. I'm not saying that this was in any way a perfect state. I'm saying that it was a country in which the energy toward democracy existed and in which many uncertain steps toward a more democratic state were happening, while there were other things that desperately needed to be changed. My description of 1967 is that I think that being put in the place, accepting the place of ruling over a large, disenfranchised, non-voting population pushed us in the other direction, eroded the democratic achievements we made and threatened other democratic achievements. It's not perfect on one side or the other. It's not as if Israel has ceased being democratic today either. I'm worried about which way the line on the graph is going. I think it was going in a better direction before 67 than afterwards.
You mentioned earlier that the Israeli law stopped at the Green Line. I was wondering, is this still the case today? And if I, say, got a speeding ticket in the West Bank, could I turn around and say, I'm not paying this because it's not Israel?
Wow. That's such a great question. Depends on which law. What happened is this. On one hand, officially, from an Israeli internal legal perspective, everything in the West Bank, except for annexed East Jerusalem, is under military law. The administering body in those areas of the West Bank that Israel hasn't turned over to the civilian administration of the PA is the army's civil administration. The minister who is responsible for governing the West Bank is the defense minister. That seems clear. Israeli law stops at the Green Line, except as, again, from an Israel has applied its law to East Jerusalem. On the other hand, starting in July of 1967, gradually, virtually unseen by the public, Israeli law has been steadily applied to Israelis living in the West Bank. So let's start with your speeding ticket, because that was the first one. A military order given at the beginning of July 1967, before there was a settlement. It was probably over a traffic accident between Israelis touring the West Bank. I don't know what situation caused this military order to be given, but it wasn't about Israelis living there, because there weren't any yet. Says that if an Israeli commits what would be an offense inside the state of Israel in the area specified, he or she can be tried before an Israeli court as if the offense took place inside of Israel. So in other words, you did something, you're accused of doing something in the territories. It doesn't have to be brought before a local court or a military court. You can be tried before the court in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem or wherever else. The law on such emergency orders is that after 6 months to stay in force, they have to be, or at least certain kinds of them have to be re-ratified by the Knesset. They can't just depend on the military commander's orders. Over the years, as the Knesset has over and over again extended this emergency order, it has added other laws that will apply to Israelis in the territories as if the kingdom is as if they're inside of Israel. So at some point or another, it was in 1984, if I'm not mistaken, they said that Israelis living in the West Bank would pay for national insurance and receive national insurance benefits as if they were inside Israel. National insurance is the whole social network. It's old age pensions, it's unemployment insurance, it's compensation if you're injured at work, right? So somebody noticed that it didn't apply to Israelis in the West Bank, so the next time the law came around for re-ratification, they added that. In 1979, another military order, notice it's a military order because the area is under military occupation. Another military order allowed the creation of Israeli-style municipal governments for Israeli settlements in the West Bank. And over the years, this order has also grown, with more and more laws being applied to those people who live within these municipal entities. When I checked the order in, I think it must have been fall of 2009, in the Hebrew University Law Library, it's a loose leaf binder that had grown to about 500 pages. So there was never a decision of the Knesset, of the government, to annex the settlements to Israel, to extend Israeli law as a whole to the settlements, but by what's referred to in Hebrew as the salami system, one small slice at a time, that's what has gradually happened. So much so that I meet settlers who really, honestly, sincerely don't understand that they're not living in the state of Israel. Even though the extension of those laws to where they live is by virtue of the orders of the military commander of the area. I hope I have you really confused now.
I just wanted to ask, assuming the border issues are resolved and there's two states, what would be the biggest threats to Israel remaining a democracy?
Well, I could make a nice long list. By the way, I don't think that that's a particularly uniquely Israeli situation. You have a democracy as long as you keep working on it. There will always be people in a democracy who would like to make it less democratic. Two of the issues are the ones that I already mentioned. I think that an intertangling and establishment of religion by the state is undemocratic, it's a violation of basic civil rights, and as I mentioned before, this isn't the state's issue, but it's also very, very bad for religion. I would start the reform there at the institution of civil marriage and divorce. I would get the government out of the business of registering what religion you belong to, and aiming for reform of the educational system. A second area is that formal and informal discrimination against the Arab and other population, at this point other non-Jews in the country, meaning economic immigrants who are illegal or refugees, is widespread. And for Israel to be a democracy, we need to work on eliminating that discrimination. Beyond those two issues, I would also note, for instance, that the rapidly growing economic inequality in Israel and the sell-off of state assets during the privatization period to a small number of what are called in Israel tycoons, but I think that word translates into Russian as oligarchs, is a direct threat to democratic rule. There's a brilliant young Russian-born historian named Dmitry Shumsky who described Israel to me as the 16th Republic of the former Soviet Union. Obviously, this is a metaphor. It's not true in every respect. Remember, I said every unhappy country is unhappy in its own ways, but there are respects that are like that. So that's another area that I think that's critical to address. When you have an immense amount of economic power in a small number of hands, even if there's no legal statement of the power of those people, obviously it influences the decisions and makes truly democratic decisions more difficult.
Okay, we just have two more questions. We promised to have you out of here by 9:30, so we will.
You expressed very nice ideas about how, I mean, the issue about you can be Jewish and democratic, but not one state solution. What do you think about what the chances of any changes in the democratic style of Israel at the moment?
The Talmud says that when the temple was destroyed, prophecy was taken from the prophets and given to fools and children. Unfortunately, the color of my beard does not allow me to claim to belong to one of those categories, and I don't want to belong to the other one. So I'm not making any prophecies. What I will tell you is that all of the major political changes that I've seen are foreign policy changes that I've seen made in Israel in the 35 years I've lived there were unexpected by the public and probably by most of the politicians involved before they happened. I arrived in Israel in September of 1977, and if you had said in September of 1977 that the president of the country that just went to war with us was going to visit the Knesset and declare his desire for peace, that was an indication of a psychiatric problem. In 1992, thinking that Yitzhak Rabin would recognize the PLO was equally, or not equally, but close to that unlikely. And on the other hand, I confess, I didn't see the second Intifada coming, or the first one. So I'm loath to make predictions. I know that in the early 80s, my wife-to-be was doing an article on a new peace organization, and she interviewed various people involved in forming it, and she asked them, what do you see as the outcome? And one of them said to her, well, I have to go off the record now, because what I'm going to say would delegitimize the group if I said it on the record, but I think we need a two-state solution. That was from a peace movement, okay? In the early 80s, if you said you were for a two-state solution, you were off the radical edge. I remember when Peace Now banned placards at their demonstrations that showed the Israeli-Palestinian flag, because being in favor of that solution would delegitimize the group. Talking about a two-state solution, favoring a two-state solution, is no longer, to put it mildly, on the radical left. At the same time that things have gotten worse in other areas, they've gotten better, and I'm not going to make any predictions about what the next development is going to be. I can argue for what I think the next development should be, but predicting it, I'm not going there.
I've enjoyed every word you've said, Gershom, and I thought I'd never find anything to argue with you, but people who know me know that I usually can. I was interested in your reply to the question about what diaspora Jews can do. You have suggested that as they are in the place of the other, they might encourage in Israel an idea of empathy for the other. However, I don't see it working like that at all. in countries like Australia and the States, Jews have become extremely comfortable and do not feel really that they are the other. And this has been shown quite recently in Australia, when the only Jewish news media was owned by somebody who promoted the idea of you should not have too much compassion. This is to do with the refugees. When whereas in the States, 3 or 4 weeks travelling, what I mostly found was that people who were fed up with the situation in Israel were retreating into their very comfortable Jewishness and looking at supporting Jewish organisations and looking to how to be Jews in the United States, and to some extent I found that here as well, that they can do without Israel. Now, I don't know, I mean, I'm only asking the how can it be that the more comfortable we are here in the Galut, that we can induce in Israel? Surely it has to come in Israel itself, this idea of sympathy or empathy for the other.
I certainly think it has to develop in Israel. I mean, you know, I'm visiting, but the place where I live and that I'm politically involved is there. But I would frame a couple of things you said differently. First of all, as a person who has written many opinion articles, I would warn you not to take one opinion article, even by the publisher, as expressing the view of a community. And, you know, in my very short time here, I've met many other Jews who are emotionally and deeply involved in the refugee issue from an entirely different point of view, thank God. And the opinions that they have expressed to me about why they're involved in that issue speak directly to a consciousness of Jewish history and what it means today. And I would also disagree with you, I would shift what you said about the American situation. Every 4 years, I get press releases from American Jewish organizations of a certain stripe telling me that this is the year that the great shift is going to take place and the Jews are going to vote for the Republicans. I've been in journalism since the 80s. The graph shows that if anything, there's fewer Jews voting for the Republicans now than there were. The old line is that Jews live like Episcopalians but vote like Puerto Ricans. And I ask myself, why is this going on? And I think the answer is very simple, because the Republican Party in the United States has been the party which rejects difference. And I think that on some level, Jews understand that their participation, in, at least in that country, that their participation and safety in a society depends on the affirmation of difference. I'm not saying this happens everywhere in the diaspora, but I certainly, in the largest diaspora community, that's certainly the case. I do think what's happened is that when Jewish communal life is defined in such a way that debate about Israeli policy, that favoring democratic trends in Israel is somehow seen as anti-Zionist, it pushes people who would otherwise be involved to say, you know what, I'm going to worry about the environment, I'm going to worry about immigrants or refugees or whatever. All those are really good issues, but it doesn't encourage the same person to express their views about Israel or to encourage diplomacy that would work toward Israel reaching a two-state arrangement, or to support groups in Israel that are working for a more democratic Israel. So part of the problem, part of that development, part of that change starts, in a sense, for the diaspora at home, which is, if you want to have an effect on creating a more democratic Israel, you have to start by democratizing Jewish community debate abroad.